Hi, everyone, and welcome to the New Body Thought Lab, a mini lecture series on race, pop culture, and the history of aesthetic surgery. My name is Jordan Taliha McDonald. I'm a PhD candidate in English with a secondary field in history of science at Harvard University, and I will be your instructor for today's lecture. Today's lecture is entitled Cutting Off Your Nose to Spite Your Race, a rhinoplasty, race, and the Black celebrity nose. So, for today's run of show, we're going to begin with a kind of pop culture case study and move our way back through pop culture to think more about the role of the history of science and the history of race science in establishing our contemporary thinking about aesthetic surgery and race. And we'll close with thinking more about the politics of enhancement as they've been articulated through the 20th and 21st century. So we begin, of course, with Big Glow. On May 21st, 2025, at 12:33 p.m., Memphis rapper Glorilla tweeted a rather succinct response to growing rumors that she had done something to her nose. She tweeted and did with a very smug emoji, and this sent the internet into an uproar, confirming suspicions that she had in fact had a rhinoplasty. Promptly changing her social media profile picture to an image of Michael Jackson, Big Glow took a historical approach to deflecting judgment, marshaling the pop culture significance of Jackson, in this case, not as the king of pop, but as a cultural symbol of Black celebrity transformation through aesthetic surgical science. And so Glorilla's decision to kind of take the image of Jackson to signal what she had herself undergone forces us to think a bit more about the history of Black celebrities and rhinoplasty, but also think more critically about the way that the nose has been racialized across history. And so we must deal with, in this particular case, the popular regard for the kind of Jackson 5 nostril and the way that the Jacksons represent the transformation of a Black celebrity family over the course of the 20th century. And so in Margot Jefferson's book on Michael Jackson, Jefferson writes extensively about the way that the Jackson family's appearance and its transformation over the course of the 20th century influenced public discourse about race and cosmetic medicine. And in this book, Jefferson writes, quote, "The Jackson boys got their father's nose. Their skin was darker than Catherine's, which was fine. They were boys. Rebby and Latoya were lighter than Joseph and had pert noses, small mouths, and the bright, obliging smiles of Midwestern girls at the state fair. Baby Janet got her mother's skin and a pug nose, which she considered a drawback once she began to have teen queen aspirations. The face of Michael Jackson that we see today has nothing to do with his genetic inheritance from Joseph and Catherine being wholly a product of surgery, cosmetology, and fashion." And later on in this book, Jefferson also speaks about the significance of Michael in particular, in the sense that he comes to represent the capacity of surgical science and cosmetology to transform the kind of racial appearance of a celebrity. And so Jefferson writes, quote, "Here was a Black person who had once looked unmistakably Black and now looked white or at least unblack. He was at the very least a new kind of mulatto, one created by science and medicine and cosmetology." I find this quote very striking for a lot of reasons, but I wanted to include it here to help us to think about the relationship between race science as a kind of historical development in terms of thinking about race as a scientific category, and which is ultimately responsible for our use of terms like mulatto or our thinking about racial mixture or miscegenation um, writ large, but also the way that this kind of language also comes to influence the way that we think about aesthetic surgery, right? Jefferson refers to Jackson as a new kind of mulatto, one created by science. One might argue that the original theorization of the mulatto is also created by a certain kind of scientized thought. But it is still very interesting that this is the language she uses to think about Jackson as a kind of medically produced form of a kind of miscegenated character. In his 1988 memoir, Moonwalk, the inimitable and enigmatic king of pop, Michael Jackson, made his first formal comment on his history of cosmetic surgery, stating that he had a cleft palate and three rhinoplasty procedures. In this memoir, Jackson writes, quote, I can't help but pick up on some of the criticism leveled at me at times. Journalists seem willing to say anything to sell a paper. They say I've had my eyes widened, that I wanted to look more white. More white? What kind of statement is this? I didn't invent plastic surgery. It's been around for a long time. A lot of very fine, very nice people have had plastic surgery. No one writes about their surgery and levies such criticism at them. It's not fair. And, in Jackson's defense, he is not the only Black celebrity of his generation and generations after to undergo these procedures. In a recent 2025 interview, Patti LaBelle explained on The Breakfast Club that, quote, a friend of mine got her nose done, and I thought, oh, I think I need to try that. Maybe I'll get more gigs. And this is a direct reference to LaBelle's 1984 procedure, which she underwent based on perceptions that her nose was, quote, too big. And we can talk more about the supposed too bigness of the nose and how a particular assessment of the nose and the nostril becomes really significant, not only in the aesthetic sense, but also in the racial sense. And this kind of moves us into our next section, flat noses, wide nostrils. And this is a section where I really want to pull out some examples of the ways that anthropologists and ethnologists and early kind of scientific thinkers establish the nose as a racial feature or as a site of racial difference. And so in 1881, English anthropologist Edward Burnett published Anthropology, in which he described the difficulty of imitating the African Negro due to the, quote, distinctiveness of Negro features. In this book, Burnett writes, quote, for the Negro's features are quite distinct. We well know the flat nose, wide nostrils, thick protruding lips, and when the face is seen in profile, the remarkable projecting jaws. And this quote is really emblematic of a great deal of what you will find if you go through 19th and 20th century writings about the Negro type. You can even go back a bit further to the 18th century and you will find similar writing, which is why I've only pulled out this particular quote, but you will find a great deal of writing which features this kind of phrasing of flat nose, wide nostrils as the primary way in which the the kind of racial feature of the Negro nose or the Negroid nose, depending on who's writing, the way that that is characterized. And so this sense of flatness and also width as metrics and measures of racial distinction is a really important thing to keep in mind as we move towards thinking about surgery as an aesthetic intervention. And in 1908, DJ Cunningham gives a presidential address on anthropology in the 18th century for the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, which featured a theory about the, quote, thick, swollen lips and flat nose of the Negro. Cunningham writes, another conception, and one which was not altogether discountenanced by Blumenbach. And side note, Blumenbach is a thinker who we have to thank or not thank for our contemporary kind of racial categories as they've been established. He's also the reason people use the term Caucasian. And you'll see that language continue on in a great deal of aesthetic surgical literature as well. But to get back to the Cunningham quote, the view what the view that that the Negro has swollen lips and a flat nose. One of the explanations that emerges for this, which I find particularly silly, for lack of a better term, is that, quote, the Negro mothers carry their infants on their backs, and in, quote, the violent motions required in their hard labor, as in beating or pounding millet, the face of the child is said to be constantly thumping against the back of the mother. By this rude treatment, the face of the Negro child was supposed to be molded into shape. And so this is one example of the wide range of ways that people were thinking about racialized features. In some cases, there was this kind of move towards thinking about it as an essential form of a racial group, right? That the Negro always has the flat nose and the wide nostrils. And in this case, we have thinkers who are attempting to come up with behavioral theories for why people have particular features. And in this case, the theory is that um, that that the quote unquote Negro child is the point at which the nose becomes flattened, right? And so from here, we move from perhaps one theory of how a nose is formed to a kind of to development of reconstructive surgery that actually allows people to reshape their noses in a more legitimate sense. And we also have to think about the way that this history of race science is also continuing to move through the development of plastic surgery through the language of reconstructive surgery, but then also through its more aesthetic formation in the 20th century. And here I feel obliged to cite, of all people, Drake, who says in a song with Sexy Red, quote, "Me and the surgeon got history." And I happen to agree with him on this. The historical context for Black people and the development of plastic surgery in America really can be traced in really important ways through histories of war and histories of slavery. And so here I have a timeline from the American Society of Plastic Surgery, which moves from the American Revolution to the Vietnam War. And I think this timeline is really helpful for establishing the way that warfare and revolution really helps to develop the surgical sciences in the United States in terms of creating the conditions for surgeons to really have to step up and establish new techniques and new innovations in the field and to become recognized as proper physicians, which was not always the case. And so here we see how the American Revolution gives way to the first surgical textbook. The American Civil War gives way to the first round of combative reconstructive surgeries, and so on and so on. And World War I and World War II also have a really significant role to play in the development of really uh, real advancements in the kind of technologies that emerge for perfecting surgical science in particular ways. And of course, we must also think about the role that slavery plays in the development of reconstructive surgical science, right? And so here I'm riffing off of the work of Horton Spillers, who says in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, that, quote, the entire captive community becomes a living laboratory. And so when I have at the top the plantation as laboratory, this is really who I'm thinking with. And something that this framework helps us to make sense of is the ways that the plantation and access to enslaved people becomes really important for a lot of early surgeons to practice their techniques. And in the case of Dr. John Peter Medower, America's first plastic surgeon of note, the plantation is a really crucial site for his experimental surgeries that ultimately make way for the kind of foundations and techniques and many of the aesthetic sensibilities as well that would influence plastic surgery's development over the next 200 years, right? As Medauer is working in the late 1700s. And so you can read more about Medauer and the particularities of his reconstructive surgeries, which were primarily gynecological. But as we see, this move from reconstructive to aesthetic is quite slippery, as even reconstructive surgeries have certain aesthetic values that they may apply, right? Like when we think about reconstructing something, we're either trying to get it as close to its original form, right? But that would mean that we have some standard for what that initial form might be. And so there are some aesthetic sensibilities built into reconstructive surgery already, but by the time we get to the 20th century, the sense of elective aesthetic surgery really begins to heighten in culture, both because of its accessibility and because of new innovations in the field. And so to return to this kind of earlier period, in once we move from the 1700s to the 1800s, we're still in this phase where early reconstructive surgeons are thinking about race and racial difference, even in the context of surgical procedure, right? And so in 1896, Rudolf Matas, who is a surgeon working out of New Orleans at the time, publishes Surgical Peculiarities of the American Negro. And in this longer text, Matas speaks at length about the kind of similarities and differences between the races. And in this context, he's primarily talking about the Negro and the white man, right? And what Matas writes in Surgical Peculiarities is that, quote, there are no apparent differences between the races on the operating table. The same technique applies to both equally well, and often, especially in the matter of resistance to shock, the Negro appears to be to better advantage than the white man. In general, in the general and local reactions of the tissues to infection, there are some differences between the races. It is in the histogenetic tendencies of the tissues that we find the real surgical contrast between them. If we are to judge from this alone, the race reveals in this last particular a marked tendency to degeneration. And I think this quote is important to think about, despite some of uh, the kind of murkiness of some of the language. I think it is an important quote to think about in terms of how surgical science is taking up race science thought, and also the ways in which notions of racial difference are moving from the kind of uh, phenotypic level to also thinking about racial difference at the level of tissues, right? And so people like Matas and surgeons like Matas are also very invested in asserting that there are additional layers to racial difference that come to explain why it is that Black patients are dying or developing severe infections on the operating table and other kinds of problems. And so we can come to see how this kind of thought actually does continue and endure into the 20th and 21st century in terms of some of our contemporary concerns around the medical establishment. And so, moving away from simply thinking about surgeons in the kind of medical sphere of people who need reconstructive surgeries and people who have injuries and other kinds of problems that necessitate their entry into the medical sphere, by the 20th century, we come to a space where surgery becomes increasingly something that people can elect to participate in, which is very new at this particular moment in time. But by the time we get to the 1920s and on, we begin to see aesthetic surgery become more accessible to celebrities in particular, but also to Americans with means. And in making the body beautiful, Historian of aesthetic surgery Sandra Gilman argues that the 20th century was a time when the drive to look less Black put cosmetology, but not necessarily aesthetic surgery, at the command of those who desired to acquire happiness by approximating a white appearance. Right. Until the 20th century, we're still in the time of Jim Crow, of course, but we're also seeing how class is also shaping some of the terrain in terms of aesthetic enhancement, right? That most people are going to turn to cosmetology over aesthetic surgery at this particular moment in time in terms of quick fixes to what are perceived to be aesthetic problems or areas for aesthetic improvement. But by the end of the century, as Gilman points out, the non-surgical innovations made to enable various kinds of racialized aesthetic modification. This would include hair straightening technologies, but is not limited to them, right? That these innovations also help to shape the direction of aesthetic surgery and the marketing of these procedures, right? That what we're seeing in the 20th century in terms of new ways of marketing to racialized groups, in terms of Black beauty marketing and things like that, are going to really come to influence the aesthetic surgery field in terms of how they come to engage with Black consumers and potential Black patients. And so during the 20th century, this is really when we begin to see major shifts in people's attitudes towards plastic surgery, particularly in its elective form. Historians like Gilman have generally argued that the late 20th century decline in stigma associated with aesthetic surgery really hinged upon changes in stigma associated with mental illness. At this particular time, there's a great deal of psychological language being used to in interpret the behaviors of people who seek out aesthetic surgeries. And this concern around establishing if someone is fit to undergo surgery becomes really important during this time period. And so we begin to see certain kinds of psychological assessments occurring to essentially like approve someone for surgery. And we're also going to see a rise in feminist criticism for and against plastic surgery. And a lot of this is going to revolve around arguments around gender empowerment and disempowerment. But we can talk more in future lectures about the wide range of feminist criticism that comes out of the 20th century thinking around plastic surgery. But it is a really rich collection of thought and intellectual tradition. And in addition to these kinds of discourses of mental health and these discourses of gender and gender disempowerment that emerges as plastic surgery becomes more accessible to the general population, we also are seeing a high increase in racialized discourses of self-hate, race betrayal, and racial self-esteem as the primary ways for thinking about Black and or other racialized groups' participation in plastic surgery and in the kind of cosmetic enhancement market. And so now we kind of have to come back to rhinoplasty in particular, right? Like we were speaking very broadly about aesthetic surgery and how do we come to this aesthetic perception of surgery and the sense that surgery is something that I can do electively. But in particular, when we go back to thinking about rhinoplasty as a very specific procedure, we come back to the nose as a real kind of hot site for racial thought. And so in thinking about the broader history, we can also kind of place this timeline from the International Society of Aesthetic Plastic Surgery into our kind of earlier timeline, which was thinking about aesthetic surgery, the history of plastic surgery in the American context. We can also kind of include the way that we might track the history of rhinoplasty in this history as well. right? And so in 1794, British surgeons observe and document Indian rhinoplasty techniques, which begins to influence Western surgical practices. In 1814, Joseph Carpue performs the first major rhinoplasty operation in the Western world. And by 1890, American surgeon John Orlando Rowe performs the first modern cosmetic rhinoplasty. And by 1901, Jacques Joseph, a German surgeon, refines rhinoplasty techniques and begins to develop other facial plastic surgery procedures, right? So the top of the 20th century, we're really coming into rhinoplasty as an increasingly cosmetic and advanced procedure, but it will continue to advance over the course of the 20th century. And part of how it advances is through its engagement with certain groups of people that present additional quote unquote challenges to the surgical profession. And one such case we can find in Rhinoplasty in the Negro, which is a 1971 article from a Miami-based plastic surgeon by the name of George B. Schneider, who publishes an article about his experience conducting a rhinoplasty procedure on a Black woman. And he opens this particular article, which was published in a major plastic surgery journal at the time. He states in this article that, quote, the Negro patient who desires a nose more in line with society's image of the Caucasian is often asking for more than his plastic surgeon is able to deliver. And these are some images that Schneider includes of his patient who is a Black school teacher. And he also provides a small amount of information about this particular client and states, quote, she was most concerned with the flaring of her nostrils, the width of her nasal dorsum, and the drooping of her nasal tip, as seen on profile. She has been evaluated by a psychiatrist and found to be acceptable for plastic surgical reconstruction. There was full knowledge that her basic desire was to resemble the Caucasian. She thought this might enhance her future teaching ability in the public school system. My apologies for the typo. Her husband was tolerant of the desire. I find this quote very interesting for a lot of reasons, both the inclusion of her husband's tolerance and the awareness that there was a direct tie between her desire for this procedure and her desire to have better chances as an educator. I think this is a very interesting case in terms of thinking about what a Black school teacher in the 1970s, what her reasons might have been for undergoing a rhinoplasty. And this is a very powerful example of the ways in which people um, came to understand that having certain racialized features would affect their livelihood, right? Their job opportunities, their access to to different work environments, different um, spaces and opportunities in their field. And as we, perhaps on some level, we obviously understand that other groups, particularly Jewish people at this particular time in the late 20th century, are also receiving a lot of attention for undergoing rhinoplasty. But rhinoplasty is obviously something that even other groups are also engaging with in certain ways. And what's interesting is that because of the racial implications of modifying the quote unquote black nose, Sandra Gilman articulates that like it becomes very difficult for us to actually track some of the earlier history of race and rhinoplasty, in part because, quote, no reputable surgeon in the United States wanted to be seen as facilitating crossing the color bar in the age of post-Reconstruction Jim Crow and miscegenation laws. And as a result, this actually created some difficulty even for white people who desired to change their noses as well. And Jacques W. Maliniak, who is the author of Sculpture in the Living, Rebuilding the Face and Form by Plastic Surgery, which was published in 1934, speaks about the nose as having strong and easily discernible racial characteristics, and how in a quote alien environment these may be highly detrimental to its possessor. And in this particular quote, what sticks out to me and may also stick out to you is that in this case, Meliniak is actually talking about how, quote, a Negroid nose is a distinct social and economic handicap to a dark-skinned Caucasian. He's not speaking about an actual Black person undergoing this procedure. He's speaking about what happens when you are perhaps a person who is racialized as white, but you have a feature that is perceived as that is perceived or has been historically associated with another race group, and how that presents particular problems for people who may desire to not experience the conditions of Black people, though they may have a nose that perhaps is perceived as a Black one. And by the 1970s, as we see with the Schneider case, with the Schneider article, we are seeing Black people more publicly undergoing rhinoplasties. But in the earlier part of the 20th century, as Gilman helps us to see, this would have been highly controversial for surgeons to be helping Black people undergo forms of transformation that perhaps would have enabled them to pass for white, or perhaps maybe as some other kind of racialized group, right? And so in Ebony magazine in 1977, we get a formal spread of a Black woman's post-operative her kind of post-operative journey, right? And so we see in this case the before and after rhinoplasty photos, and we're starting to get actual like Black media coverage of plastic surgery as something that Black people are undergoing, and as something that we can see the transformation in people who are not necessarily celebrities, right? But people more like the school teacher in the Schneider article, who are perhaps undergoing these procedures to improve their quality of life, however that is construed. And so from here, once we get into the 70s, we're also thinking more about the politics of enhancement, right? And this is the time when figures like Michael Jackson are under heightened scrutiny, right? Because this is at a point in time where we're in the era of Black power, right? But we're also in an era where people are asking different kinds of questions about the nature of these procedures, and particularly the nature of these procedures in the context of race. And so thus emerges a kind of argument of enhancement as racial effacement, right? And under this um, kind of spirit of thought, we might say, celebrity transformations become a really important touchstone, but also really important case studies for public discourse about the racial implications of enhancement, or what Margaret L. Hunter refers to as buying racial capital. And in Venus Envy, A History of Cosmetic Surgery, Elizabeth Haken asserts that in the case of superstar Michael Jackson's aesthetics transformation over the course of the 80s, that what bothers Americans about Michael Jackson's face is the race issue. Quote, the results of his surgery suggest that if he is not trying to look white, he is at least trying to look less Black. And this becomes really important in terms of how Black celebrities who undergo plastic surgery, and also just that kind of average non-famous Black person who undergoes plastic surgery, must then contend with this discourse of racial effacement, right? And so it receives a great deal of coverage in Black media. Ebony magazine here in 2004 covers why more Blacks are choosing plastic surgery. right? And then in 2007, Jet Magazine publishes an article with two Black plastic surgeons who state in their interview that, quote, there's a misconception that people getting surgery want to get a more European look. We've moved past the whole idea of Michael Jackson being the poster child for plastic surgery. And so, again, we're kind of returning back to Michael Jackson as a really crucial figure in terms of the ways that people think about race and plastic surgery, and this kind of far end, perhaps on a spectrum of thinking of surgery and this discourse of cosmetic enhancement as having a kind of racially effacing property, or that is built on the principle of racial effacement of some kind. And in order for, I think, professionals and Black patients who undergo these procedures to begin to publicly speak about their procedures, it becomes very important for many of them to distinguish themselves from the Jackson archetype. But in so doing, I think it also presents other kinds of problems for thought, which we can continue to think about over the course of several lectures. But I'm interested to see what you all think about the way that Jackson becomes a kind of rhetorical punching bag um, for people who are trying to assert that what they are doing is different from what he did in the past, and to assert that there is a kind of proper way in which Black people can undergo plastic surgery that is not akin to racial effacement. Still, questions and tensions do emerge and continue to emerge about the politics of enhancement, right? In 2009, Susan Bordeaux asks, quote, well, writes and asks in her writing, one cannot have any body that one wants, for not every body will do. Given our history of racism, a history in which bodies that look too Black or obviously Jewish have been refused admittance to public places and even marked for death, how can we regard these choices as merely individual preferences? And I think Bordeaux's question is a question that many have asked, and which informs a lot of the public discourse and judgment of Black celebrities, and perhaps even the kind of non-famous Black person's decision to undergo these procedures. And in 2003, Aaron Aubrey Kaplan publishes Black Like Me, But Not Too Black, in response to the American Society of Plastic Surgeons promotion of nose jobs for African Americans and the society's kind of promise at the top of the 21st century that they can ensure that Black people who undergo these procedures will not receive a quote unquote European nose, right? And Kaplan states in this article that, quote, it's difficult for me to believe that anybody Black getting their nose done isn't doing it to some degree to look more white and less Black, such as the still considerable burden of history. As they are so often in matters of appearance, racial considerations are never far from the surface. Again, similar to Bordeaux, Kaplan is articulating, I think, a lot of what is at stake, right, in our kind of pop culture criticism, but also in our attempts to think historically about the politics of enhancement. Still, nonetheless, a very strong move to recuperate plastic surgery from the kind of Jackson model pushes on. And part of how it does so is by adopting this rhetoric of enhancement as racial preservation, or enhancement as having the capacity to preserve racial characteristics, right? And so a 1998 Health Quest magazine article entitled Black Don't Crack features a Black woman named Karen Hutchinson who states the following about undergoing several cosmetic surgical procedures, including a nose job. And in this article, Hutchinson states, quote, I fixed my nose because it was just too wide for my face. It's still a Black nose. It just fits my face better. And many people are in agreement with Hutchins that there should be a kind of gray area for one to determine that a particular feature is unsuitable to their face without it necessarily having the without the procedure of changing that feature having the end goal of quote unquote whitening a particular person's appearance. And this ultimately gives way to the rise of ethnic rhinoplasty and other ethnic procedures or procedures that are framed as having a particular kind of ethnic specificity. And again, we will talk more about other such cases in future lectures, but in this context, we are primarily interested in thinking about ethnic rhinoplasty as a space where surgeons are establishing expertise but also where a particular clientele is being marketed to. And these two images are just a book by Stephen M. Hoffland's Ethnic Rhinoplasty and a screenshot of the Washington Post's 2007 article, Cosmetic Surgery Goes Ethnic, Shifts in Culture and Treatments Attract Minorities. And so on the official Rhinoplasty Society's website, there is a formal kind of effort to establish what ethnic rhinoplasty is and how it intends to address historical harms, although that may not be the language that we get here. But I think there is this attempt to reckon with the history of aesthetic surgery as having established or recapitulated to particular racialized standards, but also attempting to now market itself to a broader audience, right? And so the website states previous rhinoplasty techniques did not always allow surgeons to retain the unique ethnic characteristics of the nose, but it is a much different story today. Ethnic rhinoplasty refers to nose reshaping procedures that create attractive outcomes while preserving the culturally distinct features of the nose. Surgeons must understand what is perceived as beautiful based on the patient's ethnic background. And so this move, which doesn't necessarily completely articulate the history of aesthetic surgical practice and its relationship to race, which I would argue is far more complex than techniques not allowing surgeons to retain ethnic characteristics. But I do think that this is a really good example of how some of the kind of some of the societies in this particular field are attempting to grapple with their history with regard to race while also attempting to encourage a new consumer base to get rhinoplasties. And this also has major global implications, right? That the ethnic rhinoplasty is a geopolitical phenomenon, right? This is not simply about the United States. In fact, establishing themselves in an increasingly competitive market, surgeons in Turkey, Korea, Mexico, Thailand, and numerous other countries have begun to emphasize their ethnic rhinoplasty procedures and promote medical tourism to potential Black patients, as well as other patients from other marginalized racial groups. And part of how they do this is that they often market their ethnic expertise by emphasizing how the diversity or ethnic perspective of the surgeon's given country informs their ability to better serve an ethnic clientele. And in Refashioning Race, Alka K. Menon explains how, quote, cosmetic surgeons are deciding what makes something racially legible and whether a patient's request for change is something that they're willing to do, believe in questioning whether a patient's request for change is something that they're willing to do, believe is socially acceptable and consistent with the racial or ethnic identity that the patient presents. The idea here is that the surgeons have some discretion. And this is very interesting. And this also gives way to particular kinds of narratives about the cosmetic surgical profession, which increasingly start to articulate themselves as sociological or like amateur sociologists, which is the language of one particular plastic surgeon that Manon quotes in this book, who articulates that he considers himself an amateur sociologist as a result of performing cosmetic surgeries on patients who are racialized differently, and that this has given him a particular kind of knowledge of what racialized people want and what their aesthetic preferences are. But what is really helpful about what Manon is articulating in this book broadly, and I do encourage folks to read it if this particular topic interests you, is how this kind of global market is allowing surgeons to become what Manon calls race brokers, and how they are actually articulating race and establishing essential racial types and preferences and aesthetic sensibilities through their practice. And this has particularly interesting consequences, I think, for the field, but also for the marketing material, which we can talk about in future lectures. And so, to kind of close out, these are some of the big questions that this research into race and rhinoplasty have brought to the forefront for me, and which I also encourage you all to think about more in depth. What does it mean to preserve ethnicity or race in the context of surgical procedures? Can race be surgically transformed? Right? Is Michael Jackson not Black because of his procedures? Or is there another way in which we might articulate what he is or how he is racially constituted post cosmetic and surgical transformation? What does it mean to make a Black nose better? What is the right kind of Black nose? How does an understanding of the history of science enhance our thinking about race and aesthetics? In each episode of our lectures, while we will not be focusing solely on rhinoplasty, I hope to move through and talk a bit more about medical tourism and global anti-Blackness and what this means for Black people traveling for these procedures, but also Black people in these countries Black people in other countries who are also navigating the implications of medical tourism in their homes. And I also hope to talk more about, the elephant in the room, the BBLs and all of the other procedures, which some of which we may be less inclined to think of in racial terms, but which have some really interesting implications for the history of science and its intersections with histories of race making. But in each episode, ultimately, my goal is for us to unravel what Rizvana Bradley describes as the quote, braid of science and aesthetics as it was woven through the 19th century, particularly as it can be discerned in revisions of ethnological theory, modalities of vision, and the genesis of artistic form. And in the context of the New Body Thought Lab, this will primarily entail thinking about the genesis of aesthetic surgery, right? And what aesthetics means in this particular context and what notions of aesthetic form emerge and how race is really central to that development and how race actually enables the enhancement of the field for better or for worse. And these are just a few texts that have been really foundational to my thinking about race and aesthetics. We're beginning with Bell Hooks's Black Looks from 1992, Janelle Hobson's Venus in the Dark, Blackness and Beauty in Popular Culture from 2005, Underrepresentation by David Lloyd, The Racial Regime of Aesthetics from 2019, and most recently, Rizvana Bradley's Anti-Aesthetics, Black Aesthesis and the Critique of Form, which was published in 2023. And so I am really grateful to you all for bearing with me on this first episode. I'm really looking forward to enhancing the quality of my own content and seeing how we can adjust to the viewers and how you all feel about the flow of the course material. But I'm also just excited to have more conversations with you all about the material here. Thank you all so much for showing up, for coming to class, for engaging. I look forward to many more lectures. Please feel free to follow me on Instagram at New Body Thought Lab and at East Coast Literary Thought. And subscribe to this YouTube channel, leave comments down below. I forget what the YouTubers do, like subscribe down below. Yes. So I look forward to learning with you all, thinking with you all. Thank you for coming to the first installment of these lectures. Yeah, bye.